Good afternoon, folks. I hope this finds everybody well. This is going to be part 3 in my lecture series on the human reproductive system. If you have not yet watched parts 1 and 2, I strongly recommend that you hop on and watch those videos before you carry any further so that you have the necessary background for what we're going to be discussing here. And if you are in my anatomy class, I recommend you grab a copy of the handouts off the Blackboard site so that you have some important vocabulary to follow along with, spellings of words. Also, if you are in my anatomy class, you might want to have some diagrams handy either in your textbook or your lab manual so you can get a visual for the things that we are discussing on here. Particularly since what we are about to discuss is, the female sex act, and therefore if I put up images, YouTube will probably pull this video down. All right, so we have talked in the last couple of lessons about the general features of the reproductive system in humans. We have described in detail the reproductive anatomy and physiology of the human male, and we have described the anatomy of the reproductive system of the human female, as well as oogenesis and ovulation. So that gets us right up to about the point when we are going to take a look at the female sex act and the subsequent events that follow. Now, as with the male, the female sex act is regulated primarily through a number of hormones. There are actually a couple of different hormones involved in female sexual development and sexual behavior. The most prominent, of course, is the hormone estrogen, which I'm sure you are all aware of, estrogen. Estrogen is the hormone that primarily stimulates female development at puberty, stimulates the development of both the female primary sexual characteristics and the female secondary sexual characteristics. In the female of our species, primary sexual characteristics are going to include the ability to produce mature oocytes, the enlargement of the female genitalia, and the beginning of the menstrual cycle. Secondary female sexual characteristics in our species will include the deposition of fatty tissue in the hips and the breasts, a widening and thickening of the bone of the pelvis in order to more thoroughly accommodate the musculature necessary for childbirth, the development of both pubic and axillary hair. Normally, the female of our species has hair development in those particular regions, not as much on the limbs and torso as in the male of our species. And of course, the development of the sex drive in the female behavior, the impulse drive to engage in mating behavior. Now, there are a couple of different hormones involved in this whole maturing process. Female reproductive anatomy is more complex, and the processes it has to undergo are more involved than those that males have to undergo. So there are several different hormones that are importantly involved here, not only estrogen, but also luteinizing hormone, which you might recall is the one that is involved in stimulating lactation. We have follicle-stimulating hormone. Actually, both of those are gonadotropins. They're involved in stimulating the gonads for the production of gametes. Human growth hormone has an obvious role in the course of all of this. So yeah, we have luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, LH and FSH, all stimulating the production and release of gametes. We have a hormone called GnRH, capital G, little n, capital R, capital H. GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone, which in turn stimulates the production of the other hormones that I talked about. We also have progesterone, P-R-O-G-E-S-T-E-R-O-N-E. Progesterone is going to stimulate ovulation, the release of the egg in response to the normal reproductive cycle. So a bunch of different hormones involved in female sexual development, more so than in the male. I mean, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone are active in men, but not nearly as much as we're going to see in women. We are also going to find that women do get effects from androgen hormones, that the female body does produce a small amount of androgen hormones, and testosterone, which are largely responsible for regulating the libido and the sex drive. But those are an important part of female development as well. Normally, puberty in a human female commences around the ages of 11 to 13, usually slightly before the male of our species. Normally, the event that marks the beginning of puberty in the female is menarche, M-E-N-A-R-C-H-E, basically your first menstrual cycle. And at that time, you're going to see a surge in these hormone levels shortly before that, and the development of primary and secondary sexual characteristics, and the beginning of the menstrual cycle, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. So you're going to find that, as with men, estrogen levels do not hold steady, that they begin being produced at puberty. Female estrogen peaks in about the mid to late 20s, and then declines rapidly following about the mid-40s, corresponding with the period known as menopause, which again we'll talk about in a few minutes here. Now, in terms of the actual female sex act, the female sex act, like the male sex act, has a psychic phase, an emission phase, and a resolution phase. But the events here are going to proceed a little bit differently than they do with men, since obviously the female role in this is a little bit different than the male role. The male role is pretty much one of deposit sperm and go on your way. Well, okay, hopefully it's a little bit more involved than that, but you know what I mean in terms of the actual act of sexuality itself, whereas the female role is going to involve several more steps, not only the receipt of said sperm, but then subsequent events leading to fertilization and to incubation of the offspring. But the actual female sex act is regulated primarily by estrogen and by androgen hormones, which stimulate the sex drive and stimulate arousal. Even more so than the male sex act, the female sex act is prone to psychic stimulus, that is, mental stimulus, sensory stimulus that promote sexual arousal. Auditory and scent stimulus affect the female of our species more strongly than the male of our species in most instances. Visual stimulus is still an effect, but in general, women have a more sensitive sense of smell than men and are more sensitive to the scent of male pheromones than men are to female pheromones. Both are sensitive to this, but it does mean that the scent of a partner has more of a stimulating effect on the woman of our species, all other things being equal, than on the male. You're going to find that there's a heavy psychological component in the female sex act, that there is a strong need for psychic engagements rather than just physical stimulus, whereas the male sex act is strongly responsive to manual stimulus, even without any kind of associated mental stimulus attached. You will find that during the arousal phase, the psychic phase, the female body begins preparing for intercourse. The clitoris will become erect, much like the penis does. Usually means that it thickens and enlarges, but does not usually become significantly longer. Somewhat, but less so than the male penis will. The vaginal orifice will become engorged with blood, causing visible genital swelling, particularly around the labia majora. As there's more blood flow coming to that area, leads to more sensitivity in the region. There will be erection of the nipples. This happens in both sexes, but to a much larger extent in the female. And at that time, you're going to also experience a lot more lubrication of the female genitalia, that mucus and other lubricating fluids are going to be secreted by the glands within and surrounding the vulva that are preparing it for the friction action of copulation. This phase, as with the male, is strongly stimulated by tactile stimulus of the genitalia, more the clitoris than anything else. The clitoris has far more nerve endings than the other parts of the vulva or the vaginal canal itself, but stimulus of all of those areas can increase female arousal and stimulate more blood flow to the genitalia. To a much greater extent than the male, the female of our species also has erogenous zones localized elsewhere on the body. That in general, again, there are exceptions, but the female of our species normally experiences more sexual arousal from the stimulus of the nipples, the neck, the ears, and other regions of the body than the male does. Now, All of this is going to be leading towards increasing the tactile sensitivity of the genitalia in preparation for the act of copulation. During copulation itself, the secretion of lubricating fluids will be increased, as well as the secretion of fluids that will thin the vaginal mucus. You'll find that the mucus in the vagina and in the uterus becomes thinner during the act of copulation to ease the passage of sperm following male ejaculation. Now, the emission phase in the female of our species, the emission resolution cycle in human females is very different than that in males. In the male cycle, you have the emission phase culminating with ejaculation, and then sometimes accompanied by orgasm, usually but not always accompanied by orgasm at the same time as ejaculation, followed by a resolution phase during which the male penis becomes flaccid and blood drains out of it and so forth. Normally, following resolution, the male of our species will be incapable of another sex act again immediately. There is a refractory period, refractory, refractory, during which the male will be unable to become aroused again immediately. Now, the length of the refractory period is highly variable. In younger men, in teenagers, and in young men, the refractory period might only be a couple minutes. As men get older, the refractory period becomes longer and longer, ranging from minutes to hours, until in old age, it might not even be possible again the same day. You will find that frequent sexual activity shortens the duration of the refractory period, but all men experience a shortening of that period as they age. Now, there's an interesting thing about that I'll get to in a moment involving our sexual behavior, but it's kind of a side topic. Now, for the female of our species, the emission phase may or may not be accompanied via orgasm. Orgasm in the female can or cannot happen with emission. Sometimes it is going to happen very quickly. Sometimes it will take a long time. Largely, it's dependent on the degree of genital stimulation, particularly stimulation of the clitoris, more so than anything else will stimulate orgasm. Now, what is interesting about the female of our species is that the refractory period in human females tends to be a lot shorter. That although there are exceptions, in general, the female of our species will be capable of a second orgasm again relatively quickly after one. Keep in mind that one big difference in the male and female reproductive tract is that the male, among other things, has to produce more semen, release more sperm, release more seminal fluids, and so forth in preparation for a second ejaculation. With sequential ejaculations in the same time period, you will find that the male of our species generally produces less and less semen per ejaculate. Now, the female of our species doesn't need to worry about that. Normally, female orgasm will be accompanied by a release of considerable fluid from the vaginal orifice, but that's not a necessary component of sex in the way that if the male doesn't release sperm, fertilization isn't possible. Now, here's the interesting thing about this, that the female of our species then is able to sort of recover, you might say, have a much shorter refractory period, have another orgasm again very swiftly. In fact, in some cases, in the refractory period of our species, the female can have subsequent orgasms within seconds. And indeed, many orgasms in sequence are possible. There are actually people who track world records for this sort of thing, and the record for a human female under laboratory conditions being evaluated was 67 orgasms in 1 hour. I don't know much about the details of how that experiment was done. But in any case, the female of our species is capable of many more orgasms much more rapidly than the male. Now, this begs the question of, if the male orgasm is the necessary component for the release of sperm, what is the female orgasm doing? What is the purpose of it physiologically? This was an open question in medicine for a long time. And there were a lot of suggestions for many years that the female orgasm was essentially a vestige, that it was a remnant of structures basically sort of as useless as in some ways as male nipples. But we've since learned that it's not like that. Frankly, there were some pretty misogynistic viewpoints in medicine going on that devalued female sexual pleasure, and indeed during the Victorian period, it was not unusual to deny the reality of the female orgasm altogether. What we have since realized is that the female orgasm has the effect of producing smooth muscle contractions in the wall of the vagina and in the wall of the uterus that have the effect of pulling semen deeper up into the female reproductive tract. In other words, orgasm during copulation or shortly after copulation increases the odds of successful fertilization. It means that semen is being pulled more deeply into the female reproductive tract. Successive orgasms make that more likely. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, well, why would we expect successive orgasms if the male has a longer refractory period and therefore is not depositing more sperm to pull up in there? That would assume that we're assuming there's only one partner. Here I want to point out a very important detail that if you've had me for my Bio 2 class and talked about sexual selection and evolution, that human beings are not, biologically speaking, wired for monogamy, that a lot of aspects of our sexual development do not really suggest that this is the natural mating pattern for our species. The successive orgasms seen in the female of the species are primarily useful if there are multiple ejaculates ending up in her reproductive tract in sequence. Ergo, that's there's a biological expectation of sorts that she may be taking more than one mate in sequence, ergo increasing the odds of fertilization. And we will find that in our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, also called pygmy chimps, that this is exactly what happens, that the mating pattern tends to be that the female takes several male mates in succession, and that greatly increases her odds of being fertilized by one of them. Now, you will also find that there are a lot of aspects of our reproductive development and our anatomy that are strongly suggestive of non-monogamous behavior. Not only that, but we also have the fact that the male of our species, consider the shape of the male penis, the glans, has that flared tip. Why is that? That's a scoop. The glans is a scoop to pull away the semen of a competing male. That with the action of copulation, thrust in, catch it on sort of the back fringe of the glans, pull back out, pulls other males' semen further away, while yours is being deposited deeper in. Therefore, it's basically an evolutionary strategy for ensuring that the semen of the most recent male is that closest to fertilizing the female. And that would not be a necessary evolutionary development if the female was not regularly taking multiple mates whose semen needed to be pulled out of the way. It's also worth pointing out the refractory period in men goes down sharply in the presence of a second female. In other words, if there's an opportunity to fertilize more than one female, the male body responds by basically getting ready for sex faster. And that's basically because consider this, folks, that we say that males are the fast sex, females are the slow sex. That does not just have to do with gamete production. Males produce lots of gametes fast, females produce few gametes slowly. It also has to do with reproductive strategy, that the female of the species can only gestate a single young at a time, and she only has a limited time frame in which she can become pregnant at any given cycle of her, any given part of her menstrual cycle. Ergo, it makes the most sense for the female of the species to have the greatest opportunity of being fertilized in that gap as possible. In other words, taking multiple mates in the relatively short period of fertility is an optimal strategy for being fertilized during the short period of time in which you can be. For males, there's also motive to take multiple mates because males, as the fast sex, produce new gametes more rapidly. But once a given male has fertilized a given female, she can't be fertilized again for months or even more than a year in some cases. Ergo, the male reproductive strategy, keeping in mind that the basic goal of reproduction in all sexually reproducing organisms, not just humans, is produce as many offspring as possible. Your DNA wants to be replicated. That's the driving force of evolution. So the optimal male reproductive strategy, since females once fertilized can't be fertilized again for a while, is to fertilize another female. Ergo, we have basically behavioral strategies and, in fact, reproductive features like faster refractory periods in the presence of multiple available females to facilitate that. So, yeah, many aspects of our reproductive behavior and biology are really not geared around monogamy. And if you take an anthropology class, you will learn very rapidly that monogamy is, in point of fact, not the human norm. It it's just the norm in our particular culture, or at least we pretend it is, even though majorities of both men and women, even in happy relationships, report cheating at least once. Make of that what you will. But we're getting off topic. So, female sex act can feature successive orgasm one after another. There will be a resolution phase following orgasm, during which there's a flood of endorphins, a flood of oxytocin, just like with the male, again promoting bonding with the individual who may have just sired a child with you. And then you're going to have a period of relaxation in the body, but continued sexual stimulus in the female will tend to lead to more emission phases in sequence. So that's a big difference in how male versus female reproductive anatomy tends to work. All right, so assuming the sex act has been completed, now what is going to happen here are that the sperm are going to endeavor to make their way to the egg. Let's talk about fertilization. Now, remember that the egg, if it has been successfully captured by the fimbriae, is still in the uterine tubes. It has not left that area. The egg will wait in the uterine tubes to be fertilized. It has no motility like the sperm. So the sperm will pass through the vaginal canal, through the cervix, up through the cervical canal and the body of the uterus, and presumably make their way into the uterine tubes. Remember, a lot of them aren't going to make it. The male releases hundreds of millions of sperm at a time because most of them are never going to get anywhere close to the egg. They're going to die en route, either stopped by the defenses of the female body against pathogens, or trapped in the vaginal mucus, or going the wrong way and getting lost, or using up their entire acrosome before they get there. So a significant percentage of the sperm released never get anywhere close to the egg. Now, should the sperm get to the egg, a sperm with an acrosome still intact will attach to the surface of the egg, use its acrosome to basically digest an opening in the egg's membrane by which the head of the sperm can penetrate it, thereby delivering its DNA. Remember, both the sperm and the egg are haploid cells. They are 1N cells with 23 chromosomes each. That is one half of a complete set. 23 from mom, 23 from dad. We now have a full set of 46 chromosomes, and we have just conceived a zygote, Z-Y-G-O-T-E. The zygote is a fertilized egg. It is the egg that has a full chromosomal set. All the chromosomal DNA, 50% came from mom, 50% came from dad. Even if you resemble one parent more than the other, you got equal amounts of chromosomes from both. All of your mitochondrial DNA, of course, comes from mom. The mitochondria are in the midpiece of the sperm, not the head of the sperm. And normally the midpiece does not penetrate the egg during fertilization. Ergo, the sperm do not normally give their mitochondria to the egg. So all of your mitochondrial DNA came from mom. As I may have mentioned last time, we have recently learned that there is a vanishingly tiny possibility, about like 1 in 200 million or something like that, that a male mitochondrion will end up in the egg, and you'll get a little bit of mitochondrial DNA from dad, but that is the exception, not the rule. In general, we have to think in terms of mitochondrial DNA being maternal. All right, so that's fertilization. As soon as the egg is fertilized, it is going to release compounds that basically kill any other sperm that are approaching to prevent multiple fertilization instances. Following fertilization of the egg, the zygote will be transported down the uterine tube by the action of cilia in its lining. The cilia will carry that zygote down the length of the uterine tube and into the uterus, where ideally implantation will occur. Implantation, I-M-P-L-A-N-T-A-T-I-O-N, is when the zygote will embed itself in the lining of the uterus. It will embed itself in the endometrium. If it successfully does so, then the endometrium will thicken around it. We will begin developing a specialized organ called the placenta, P-L-A-C-E-N-T-A, which only exists during gestation, in order to nourish the developing zygotes. Now, I should point out, pregnancy does not begin the moment egg penetrates sperm. That's conception, C-O-N-C-E-P-T-I-O-N. Conception is when the egg penetrates the sperm. But pregnancy does not automatically follow. On average, it takes 7 to 8 days for the zygote to make its way down the uterine tube and into the uterus to become implanted. So normally implantation occurs about a week after fertilization. If it does not successfully occur in that time, if the zygote does not make it to the uterine lining and embed in the endometrium in that time, it will die and pregnancy will never occur. This happens more often than not. It is way more likely that implantation will fail than will succeed. We believe, in fact, that there's more than a 90% chance. It's hard to measure because it's hard to know how many times it failed, but it does appear that about 90% of the time the zygote will not successfully implant and fertilization will not take place. So this is a thing. Now, assuming that implantation has successfully occurred, the zygote will begin mitotic division. Okay, well, let me back up a step. That the sperm penetrates the egg, but what it's penetrating is not actually the finished oocyte. It is penetrating the secondary oocytes, which will then complete its development after that. We actually don't finish meiosis II until after fertilization occurs. Breaks two, you normally get one body with all of the cytoplasm. That is the one that is going to be the egg that we think of that is going to carry the sperm. The other body, it contains very little cytoplasm. It's called the polar body. It degenerates and does not lead to anything. Now, 7 to 8 days after implantation, after fertilization, the zygote has implanted in the uterine wall. It begins to undergo mitotic division, turning into a ball of cells. We initially form a hollow ball of cells called the blastula, B-L-A-S-T-U-L-A. Then the blastula will fold in on itself and form multiple layers of cells, turning into a gastrula, G-A-S-T-R-U-L-A, so named because it has a cavity inside of it. Gast means stomach or internal sac. The gastrula has one external opening leading into an internal sac. That external opening will eventually become the anus in the developing fetus. The gastrula will form 3 distinct layers of cells. You might remember this from our discussion of tissues way back in A&P1, the primary germ layers: ectoderm, endoderm, mesoderm. At this point, we shift into embryonic development. The embryo is going to be a ball of cells that begins gaining features somewhat reminiscent of the parent organism. Embryonic development does not begin till about 8 weeks after fertilization. We only have, well, actually, it begins about a month after fertilization, I should say. By about 8 weeks after fertilization, the embryo will distinctly resemble a miniature member of the species. It will be what we call a fetus at that point. Embryo, E-M-B-R-Y-O, fetus, F-E-T-U-S. Some older textbooks spell it F-O-E-T-U-S, or with the digraph that fuses the O and the E together, but you don't need to do that. That's old-fashioned. But anyhow, so our sequence then is fertilization leads to zygote. Zygote implants in the uterine wall 7 to 8 days later. Begins mitotic development, forms first a blastula, then a gastrula. There's actually another stage in there called the nerula, in which we form the beginnings of the central nervous system, the neural streak, as it is known. Nerula is N-E-U-R-L-A. N-E-U-R-U-L-A. By about a month in, 30 to 40 days in, we now have an embryo, which is a ball of cells with distinct layers. Embryo initially does not look like anything. The embryo in this form does not have any recognizable tissues, does not have organs, does not have limbs, does not have a heart, does not have lungs. You see billboards that say, okay, your infant's heart is beating after 19 days. No, it's not. It doesn't have a heart yet. There's a twitchy patch of cells that will eventually develop into the heart, but no, there is no heart, there is no blood, nothing like that. That's going to be a while. Between about 4 and 8 weeks, embryonic developments is going to continue. We're going to develop more and more distinct features until we have a fetus, which is sort of a miniature, bilaterally symmetrical organism that is developing slowly into the adult form. If you looked at a human fetus, a cat fetus, and a dolphin fetus early in their development, they would all look pretty much exactly the same. They all have gill slits early in their development. They all have a tail early in their development. Their limb buds are very tiny and stubby and small, because these are all things that are going to happen that will change during your developments, and they reflect earlier stages of your evolution. If I look at a developing embryo, I can learn an awful lot about your evolutionary pathway, because, yeah, early in embryonic development, you have gill slits, which close up and eventually become your ear canals. You have a tail, which eventually shrinks and becomes your tailbone. These are all things that happen in the course of your embryonic development, that in other animals, that tail will remain external, or the gill slits will become gills, or what have you. I'm not going to go through the full cycle of human development, but as you are probably all aware, it is approximately a 9-month process in our species, followed by the events known as parturition, or childbirth. P-A-R-T-U-R-I-T-I-O-N. Parturition is the formal events of childbirth. But let me back up for a second here. Back to fertilization. I want to comment on a thing about this. Fertilization isn't easy. Fertilization itself can only happen at limited times. And here's the thing you need to know about that. That once the egg is released, once ovulation occurs, the egg remains viable to be fertilized for approximately 24 hours. If the egg is not fertilized within 24 hours, it will die. So you have a short window following ovulation during which pregnancy is even possible. Now here's another thing to know about that. Sperm can survive in the female reproductive tract for up to 6 days. So that means that sex before fertilization, before ovulation, can still result in fertilization. Basically, sexual intercourse up to 5 days before ovulation or up to 1 day after ovulation can potentially result in fertilization. So basically, you have a 1-week window. You have a period of 5 days pre-ovulation, the day of fertilization, basically the day post-ovulation. That's about the time frame in which the egg can potentially be, or rather I should say not the time in which the egg can be fertilized. That's the time frame in which sex can result in fertilization. Anything prior to about 5 days before ovulation, the sperm are going to be gone by then. Anything more than a day after ovulation, the egg is going to die. So yeah, you've got about a 1-week window in which fertilization is possible. If that doesn't happen, well, that means that you're not conceiving that month. Speaking of, that brings us to the cyclical nature of the female reproductive cycle. Males produce gametes all the time. 24/7 gametogenesis is happening in fertile males. Females, however, have a distinctly different cycle for their reproductive activity because you're not available to be fertilized at all moments. And that is what we call the menstrual cycle. M-E-N-S-T-R-U-A-L, or menstruation. M-E-N-S-T-R-U-A-T-I-O-N, menstruation. This is the periodic, well, the menstruation is not the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is the periodic sequence of changes in the uterus and the ovaries that occurs in a sexually mature, non-pregnant female in order to produce a secondary oocyte and basically get ready for its implantation. So the menstrual cycle is all the events by which the female reproductive tract gets ready to ovulate, gets ready to implant the zygote, and ovulates. That's the sequence of events that happens there. Now, the typical length of the human menstrual cycle, this varies from one species to another, but in humans, the textbook perfect length of the menstrual cycle is 28 days. Now, that is going to be variable. Not every female human will have exactly a 28-day menstrual cycle. Sometimes it's a little bit longer, sometimes it's a little bit shorter. In a healthy woman, the cycle may be as short as 18 days or as long as 40 days, but 28 to 29 days is about the length. Incidentally, that is about the exact same length as a lunar month, which was certainly a fact noticed by ancient peoples which is why in so much ancient folklore and in so much cultural symbolism, the moon is associated with the feminine, and menstrual cycles are associated with lunar cycles. There's no actual connection between them. It's coincidence that the female body and the lunar cycle are both on a 28 to 29 day cycle, but it led to that connection being made. Now, there are several distinct phases in the female menstrual cycle. First phase 1 is the menstrual phase, days 1 through 5. This is what happens when basically fertilization did not happen. This is after the previous cycle is done. If fertilization happened, we move into the developmental phase in preparing the baby, at which time the menstrual cycle generally stops. But in phase 1, the menstrual phase, this assumes you have not become pregnant previously. This is days 1 through 5 of your cycle. During that time, estrogen levels will fall. This period will be marked by menstruation, also referred to as menses, M-E-N-S-E-S, or sometimes as menstrual bleeding. During this phase, what's going to happen is that parts of the endometrium are going to slough off the lining of the uterus. In preparation for fertilization, the endometrium of the uterus why can't I talk today? The endometrium of the uterus thickened in preparation for implantation. Now that that's done and it's not happening anymore, the uterus says, okay, fine, we're going to tear down all the wallpaper. There's not a baby going into this room. And basically, the thicker endometrial lining will slough off. This will result in the discharge of portions of the endometrial lining as well as blood associated with the breakdown of that tissue. Contractions of the myometrium will help to move this along, leading to some pain associated with all of this. Hormonal secretions will normally be a little fluctuating at this time, and they tend to fall steadily during the menstrual phase. And the menstrual discharge, you get, of course, the blood, and the thicker masses within that menstrual blood are portions of the endometrial lining. That's days 1 through 5 normally. Starting day 5 through 13 is phase 2, sometimes called the proliferation phase, Proliferation. During the proliferation phase, we are going to experience a gradual thickening of the endometrium as the uterus basically says, okay, we're gonna make another try at this. So we're gonna thicken the endometrium, preparing for the release of a new egg. And that will go on from day 5 till day 13 or 14 under normal cycles. Basically, the uterus gets ready in case fertilization occurs. Typically, ovulation happens on day 14. That leaves us 1 day of fertile availability, during which any sperm that are already present or get introduced can potentially fertilize the egg. If fertilization occurs during that day, we move on to the events I described leading to conception, and implantation and development of the infants. Assuming, however, that fertilization does not occur during that day, we move into what is called the secretory phase, S-E-C-R-E-T-O-R-Y, which goes from days 15 until 28. During the secretory phase, the endometrium is going to produce hormonal secretions and thicken further as it gets ready to receive a possible fertilized egg. The endometrium doesn't know whether it's been getting an egg coming or not. And don't forget that the egg can take up to 8 days to leave the uterine tubes and implant. So it's going to be till about day 28 is this phase. Now remember, however, we had fertilization up till about day 15. About 8 days after that, up till about day 23, is a window in which implantation is likely to occur. Starting around day 25, the uterus begins to get the idea that an egg is not showing up this month, or rather that a zygote is not showing up this month. So around days 25 or 26, the endometrial lining begins to atrophy. At that point, portions of the endometrium begin to slough off, and we start menstruation anew. Contractions of the myometrium during this time will lead to what we call menstrual cramps. You all know about that. And therefore the discharge of the endometrial lining. And we begin the whole cycle again, starting about day 28. Now, assuming fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum on the ovary does not atrophy, and that will prevent the shedding of the endometrial lining. The hormonal secretions from the ovaries will prevent the endometrial lining from sloughing off in order to provide an environment to sustain the zygote. So that's going to be our normal menstrual cycle. Now, a lot of things can go wrong with this. Menstrual cycles are subject to a lot of different conditions. They are subject to emotional stress. They are subject to changes in diets. They are subject to hormonal fluctuations for a wide variety of reasons. They are subject to activity level. Testosterone levels can change your level of production. Higher testosterone tends to interfere with the ovulatory cycle. Now, the absence of a menstrual cycle. Obviously, if you miss a period, the thing that we tend to think of is, did I get pregnant? But you can miss a period for other reasons as well. The absence of a menstrual cycle is known as amenorrhea. A-M-E-N-O-R-R-E-H-E-A. Weird spelling, 2 R's, silent H. Amenorrhea is the absence of a menstrual cycle. You can have either primary or secondary amenorrhea. Primary amenorrhea means you never menstruate in the first place. Something was going on in your body that prevented you from ever undergoing proper menstrual development. This normally indicates abnormal pituitary gland development. It can also be an indicator of Turner syndrome, the monosomic condition in which a child is born with one X chromosome and no secondary sex chromosome at all. But if primary amenorrhea happens, that's going to be sterility. You're not going to ever be able to become pregnant. Now, secondary amenorrhea is the cessation of the menstrual cycle later in life for any other reason. This can be caused by a wide variety of things. Poor diet, anorexia, bulimia, or just malnutrition in general can result in amenorrhea. Strenuous athletic training increases testosterone levels and therefore can disrupt menstrual cycles, particularly with inadequate nutrition during the training, but a lot of female athletes who are training hard may find that their menstrual cycles are irregular or even stop for a time. Head trauma can disrupt pituitary gland secretions and can interfere with the menstrual cycle as a result. Tumors affecting the hypothalamus or pituitary gland can mess with the menstrual cycle. And a number of ovarian or uterine disorders can mess with the menstrual cycle. The most well-known of these, which is a condition that approximately 1 in 4 women will deal with at some point in their lives, is what we call polycystic ovarian disease. P-O-L-Y-C-Y-S-T-I-C, polycystic, also known as leiomyomas, L-E-I-O-M-Y-O-M-A-S, or leiomyoma, singular. That is better known as ovarian cysts. This is characterized by the formation of fibrous masses known as ovarian fibroids, F-I-B-R-O-I-D-S, usually on the surface of the ovaries, although in some cases they can spread into the uterine tubes or even the uterine lining. Your ovarian cysts are these fibrous, fluid-filled masses. The rupturing of an ovarian cyst is extraordinarily painful, and also because the ovaries are located in about the same region of the abdomen that the appendix is, it is not uncommon for a woman who is experiencing sharp pain in that region to think she has appendicitis when she's actually experienced the rupturing of an ovarian cyst. Again, about 1 in 4 women will experience ovarian fibroids at some point during their lifetime. This can result in disruption of the menstrual cycle. It can result in extreme pain, inflammation of the female reproductive tract, severe menstrual bleeding, and either too frequent menstruation or too infrequent menstruation, disruption in the normal cycle one way or another, with extremely painful menstruation when it does happen. We do not know the cause of ovarian fibroids. Cause is unknown. It does seem to run in families. The tendency for them to happen does appear to be a familial tendency. They can happen at any age, but they seem to be most common in women in their 20s and 30s. They can be surgically removed if detected. Sometimes it becomes necessary to remove one or both ovaries if this happens, or even to perform a hysterectomy, Hysterectomy. Hysterectomy is the surgical removal of the uterus. That is a thing that sometimes has to be done if the ovarian cysts are forming in the uterine lining, which that happens, honestly, it's going to be very difficult for successful fertilization to happen from there. And it is worth pointing out that there is a strong link between the prevalence of ovarian cysts and the occurrence of ovarian cancers. So dealing with those cysts is very much an important thing. A woman who gets multiple episodes of them, a lot of times the most health-safe thing to do is to remove either one or more ovaries or to perform a hysterectomy altogether. Oh, by the way, if you don't know this term, the operation for the removal of an ovary and its associated uterine tube is called a salpingo-oophorectomy. Salpingo, S-A-L-P-I-N-G-O dash oophorectomy, O-O-P-H-O-R-E-C-T-O-M-Y. That can be a monolateral, that is, you take out one, or a bilateral, in which you take out both. And sometimes that's honestly the best way to deal with ovarian cysts if they are a recurrent problem. All right, so what happens when all this ends? Because female sexual development, unlike male sexual development, does in fact end at a certain point. Once a man begins producing sperm, he will continue to do so for the remainder of his life, barring something else that interferes with his fertility. But even a healthy woman will eventually experience menopause, M-E-N-O-P-A-U-S-E, which is the cessation of menstrual cycles. In most women, this occurs between the ages of 40 and 50. There are rare instances in which it happens earlier. There are rare instances of women who remain fertile into their 50s. But normally, menopause begins around the mid-40s. It is usually preceded by several years of perimenopause, P-E-R-I, menopause, 3 to 5 years of irregular cycles preceding the actual occurrence of menopause. Menopause itself is caused by age-related changes in the ovaries. A lot of times this involves becoming more resistant to desensitized over time to FSH and LH, the degeneration of follicles, and lowering levels of progesterone and testosterone. During menopause, the uterus will decrease in size and its walls will become thinner. The vaginal walls will become thinner during this time and lose elasticity, as well as usually losing some of their lubrication. Sexual intercourse often becomes more painful during menopause. Perimenopause is also characterized by hot flashes. You all heard that term. Hot flashes are abrupt changes in the set point of body temperature, leading to irritability, fatigue, bouts of anxiety, and uncomfortable, temporarily elevated body temperature. The occurrence of menopause is usually accompanied by at least a temporary reduction in libido, sometimes a lasting reduction. In some cases, menopause is accompanied by severe emotional disturbances, particularly in women who have a history of bipolar disorder, depression, or other serotonin-related disorders. Following menopause, there's normally a stabilization of these symptoms, and of course, the main thing that happens is the cessation of menstruation altogether, and coming with that, the cessation of ovulation, during which fertilization basically can no longer occur. Now, the symptoms associated with menopause can be treated with hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, but it is increasingly not being done. And we now increasingly try to do that only when it seems to become really necessary for mom's health and well-being. In large part because we have found that there is a strong correlation between hormone replacement therapy and the occurrence of strokes. That it seems like adding extra estrogen and progesterone to the body at that time seems to increase the risk of hypercoagulability and therefore increase the risk of the formation of intravascular clots, making the woman more prone to strokes, heart attacks, and embolisms. So increasingly because of that danger, particularly in women who have blood pressure issues or other cardiovascular issues, hormone replacement therapy is not being recommended to deal with these symptoms because it seems like the dangers associated with it may exceed the benefits of it. All right, so let us suppose that parturition has happened. We're not going to go through all the stages of the birthing process. That's kind of beyond the scope of this. There's a wonderful human growth and development class at my college that you should definitely take that goes through all of this in much more detail, including a much more detailed examination of the process of development itself. I will say that parturition is characterized by rhythmic contractions of the smooth muscles of the uterine wall. During parturition, these contractions will come more and more frequently. This will eventually result in quote-unquote the breaking of the water, which means the rupturing of the amniotic sac, the fluid sac, amniotic, the fluid-filled sac that surrounds the developing infants. These uterine contractions will get more and more intense over time, at which time the mother will feel an increasing urge to push, to powerfully contract the skeletal muscles of the abdominal wall and the pelvic floor. Successive contractions and pushes will cause the head of the infant to be pushed against the cervix. Pressure against the cervix stimulates the release of the hormone oxytocin, which has the effect of relaxing the cervix. That opens the cervix up more, so more of the infant's head can push through. This results in stimulating the release of more oxytocin, and you get a feedback loop here, where the more the infant slides into the cervix, the more oxytocin is released, which opens up the cervix even more, until eventually the cervix opens wide enough that the infant's body is able to pass through and exit the body by way of the vaginal canal. This process can be rapid. This process can take days. In my own life, I am aware of a friend who took 72 hours giving birth. My mother, by contrast, gave birth to my sister in 19 minutes. So this is a highly variable process, and needless to say, there are all manner of complications that can happen along the way. If the infant is particularly large, then sometimes if the infant is very large relative to the size of the woman's pelvis, vaginal delivery may be exceedingly difficult. Also, if the infant is turned the wrong way within the abdomen and is trying to be born, feet first or whatever, this may not work. In which case, in some instances like that, the only safe option is a surgical intervention known as a cesarean section. Caesarian, cesarean section, which is basically the surgical opening up of the uterus and removing the infant directly that way. Cesarean section, obviously, if we can avoid it, is a thing that we want to avoid doing because it does weaken the walls of the uterus. Once you have had one, having subsequent children without one becomes much more difficult, and it's likely you'll have to have additional cesareans should you deliver a child again, because there's a greater risk of the uterine wall tearing once you have had a scar from a cesarean section. Incidentally, the name cesarean section, and a lot of textbooks capitalize the C in that, because it's named after a historical figure who was delivered in that way, a Roman general whose name is spelled Ceasar. You've probably heard him called Julius Caesar. That is a mispronunciation. The proper pronunciation of that name in Latin is Kaiser. Julius Kaiser is how you should be saying it. But the term cesarean section, nobody's going to start calling it a Kaiserian section. That's just how we're going to say it. It was not invented for him. It was named after him because of his fame, but it was actually invented, as far as we can tell, by medicine women working in Eastern Africa in the region of Nubia and Sudan at least 1,000 years before the birth of Caesar. And it was actually learned by the Romans from encounters with Africans. So we don't actually know who specifically invented it. All right. Now, immediately following birth, that flood of oxytocin, incidentally, in mom's body has nothing else to do once the cervix has relaxed and the baby's out of the body. But remember how oxytocin is the cuddle hormone and it promotes feelings of emotional well-being and emotional bonding, which is a real good thing to have happen right when mom gets her new baby put directly into her arms. Promotes immediate bonding with that infant. And therefore, that's an important development of maternal instinct thing that happens there. And it's one reason why it is important to have maternal-infant contact relatively soon after birth. Now, naturally, that baby's going to be hungry. So let's shift to a different part of the female reproductive system that is not involved in sex or childbirth at all. Let's talk about the mammary glands. Now, your mammary glands, M-A-M-M-A-R-Y, first off, the entire breast is not the mammary gland. A lot of people make that mistake. The mammary glands are a series of modified apocrine sweat glands located in a ring around the nipple. They're the milk-producing glands. Now, the breast features raised nipples, which are surrounded by a dark pigmented region called the areola, A-R-E-O-L-A-E. That's the plural. Areola, A-R-E-O-L-A, is the singular. So the areolae are the dark pigmented regions, normally larger. Both the nipple and the areola are normally larger and more sensitive in women than they are in men. They're usually small raised bumps on the areola. Those are areolar glands. The areolar glands secrete lubricating fluids to prevent the nipple from becoming chafed during nursing. Now, the nipples contain tiny amounts of smooth muscle, which will contract in response to cold, touch, or sexual arousal, causing enlargement of the nipple and tightening of the nipple, which promotes both sexual stimulus and also nursing, making it easier for the infant to latch onto the enlarged nipple. Now, the breast itself is a thing that develops at puberty. The effects of progesterone cause the breast and nipple to enlarge during puberty, causing fat stores in the vicinity of the breast. The breasts themselves are supported by suspensory ligaments from the thoracic wall, which gradually weaken and stretch out with age, causing the breasts to begin to sag a bit over time. The degree to which that happens varies from one individual to another. Now, breast development does occur in some males during puberty, which is, needless to say, usually a disturbing event for a young man. But normally that is going to stop. It's usually a result of a hormonal fluctuation. Permanent male breast development is called gynecomastia, G-Y-N-E-C-O-M-A-S-T-I-A, usually indicates either steroid abuse or significant hormonal imbalances, often a result of hormonal, like adrenal tumors or pituitary tumors in men can lead to gynecomastia. Now, around each nipple, you're going to find a ring of mammary glands. Each mammary gland is surrounded contains 15 to 20 compartments called lobes, surrounded by fatty tissue, adipose tissue. Within each lobe, you will find the lobules, L-O-B-U-L-E-S. The lobules contain milk-secreting pockets called alveoli, A-L-V-E-O-L-I. Yes, that's the same term as the air sacs in the lungs, and yes, it's the same term as the gaps in your jaw that hold your teeth, and alveolus is a gap or a pocket. Within the alveoli, you will find myoepithelial cells, M-Y-O-E-P-I-T-H-E-L-I-A-L. Myoepithelial cells surround the alveoli and contract to squeeze out the milk that the alveoli secretes. That milk is then discharged into lobule ducts. The lobule ducts converge to form the lactiferous duct, L-A-C-T-I-F-E-R-O-U-S. One lactiferous duct exits each lobe. and then opens to the surface of the nipple. The nipple also features a lactiferous sinus, a cavity within it that will store milk, which often causes the nipples of lactating women to become enlarged and swollen, even in the absence of stimulus. Lactation, Lactation, or the secretion of milk, often begins around month 5 to 6 of pregnancy. It will continue for as long as an infant is being fed. So basically, as long as that breast is regularly being fed, as long as there's milk being removed from it, whether by suckling of an infant or pumping, then that breast will continue producing milk. So women will continue to lactate basically as long as they've got an infant to feed. This led at one time, by the way, to the development of a profession we don't really have today, known as a wet nurse, in which a woman who had usually a peasant woman or a poor woman who had a child would rent her services as basically a feeder to an upper class woman who there was a belief at one time that feeding your own baby was beneath your dignity if you were like an aristocratic or noble woman or whatever, or even taking care of your own infant was beneath your dignity. So they would hire a wet nurse who was lactating from having had a child of her own to basically feed your baby on your behalf. And wet nurses could keep right on doing that as long as they continued to lactate. So they could keep lactating for years. Incidentally, the World Health Organization recommends that children not stop nursing until at least the age of 2, and in some developing countries where nutrition is otherwise hard to come by, as recently as the age of 5. We are extremely unusual in our culture in how early we tend to wean our children. And I know a lot of you hearing that are saying, whoa, what now? 2-year-old still nursing? Yeah, actually, that's probably healthy. Not to say they won't also be eating solid food in that time, but, that supplemental mother's milk actually helps a lot, particularly in immune development. Because remember from our discussion of immune system, mom passes on antibodies and plasma proteins to her infant through the milk in addition to nutrients, ergo helping the development of that child's immune system while they are very young and their immune system has not yet had a chance to develop a lot of resistances. So we probably should honestly be nursing a bit longer than we tend to in our society. An interesting thing about lactation, it can be stimulated by the awareness of hungry babies. Experiments have found that women who work in nurseries, who work in OB wards, and are regularly exposed to the cries of hungry infants will often begin to lactate. That apparently there's a psychological component in here where the awareness of a baby being hungry will stimulate some pituitary things in the brain, which will stimulate lactation in some instances. So sometimes a woman who's never even been pregnant will begin to lactate if she's around young babies of nursing age and hearing them cry all the time. And we don't know fully how this happens, but it's a documented phenomenon. It is worth noting that men can also lactate, that particularly if a man has breast development, but for other reasons, lactation is possible. Persistent pumping of a male nipple has been shown experimentally to begin to result in lactation, although because the male body does not have the fat stores the female body does, the milk produced is less rich, but it does seem to be a thing that can happen. This begs the question, why do men have nipples? Basically, the reason men have nipples is because the genes that control the production of nipples are not found on the sex chromosomes. Ergo, every sex has them because the genes for them are not a sex chromosome unique feature. All right, so that gets us through our look at the structural and functional things about the male and female reproductive systems. But I would like to take a few minutes here to talk about some pathologies. Let's talk about some things that can go wrong. In the female reproductive system, a problem that some women are going to experience is a thing called endometriosis, endometriosis. Endometriosis is characterized by the formation of endometrial tissue outside of the uterus. It's the formation of abnormal endometrial tissue. During menstruation, you have that thickening of the endometrial lining. Well, in endometriosis, that tissue forms places that it shouldn't, like not in the uterus. In endometriosis, you can have the appearance of endometrial tissue in the vagina. in the uterine tubes, on the surface of the ovaries, and even in some cases in the wall of the pelvic cavity and on the colon. You can also have abnormal thickening of the endometrial lining in non-pregnant women. This leads to a lot of pain, disrupted menstrual cycles, usually heavy menstrual bleeding, frequently pain associated with sexual intercourse, and disrupted fertility. So it's a painful condition. Surgically, the best you can do for endometriosis at this point in time is to go in and painfully scrape away the excess endometrial tissue. The causes of endometriosis are not well known, but it does appear to run in families. And usually if a woman experiences it early in life, she will experience other episodes again later in life. We do not know the reason why it happens so infrequently, but why it tends to come back after like 10 years of not being there. That's not really clear. The infrequency of the condition and the irregularity of it make it necessarily very difficult to study. But there again does seem to be a familial tendency for it to happen. Now, a pregnancy complication that many women will have to deal with, about 1 in 5 women will experience during pregnancy, is the complication known as preeclampsia. P-R-E-E-C-L-A-M-P-S-I-A. So 2 E's in there, preeclampsia. Preeclampsia is characterized by the formation of inadequate blood vessels going through the placenta to the developing infants. That is going to result in difficulties in blood pressure management in mom's body as she tries to get adequate blood to the developing baby. Things that characterize preeclampsia include heightened blood pressure, the occurrence of severe headaches, pain and nausea, and often vomiting in the abdominal region. Sometimes damage to the livers or kidney or liver dysfunction. Jaundice often accompanies preeclampsia. Irregular urination often accompanies preeclampsia. One of the symptoms we look for, clinically speaking, is proteinuria, the occurrence of proteins in the urine. Reduction in platelets during preeclampsia means thinning of the blood and harder time controlling bleeding. Also will lead to the accumulation of fluid and tissue. Edema can come with this. And sometimes in severe cases, blurred vision can accompany this. And sometimes eclampsia. If you take away the pre and have eclampsia, that's all the preeclampsia symptoms plus the incidence of seizures. In that case, you have to run the risk of premature birth as well, or even miscarriage. Cardiovascular disease can be a consequence of this, or existing cardiovascular diseases can be exacerbated. And in the extreme cases, rapid hemolysis can occur, the rapid breakdown of red blood cells, which can result in the death of the mother if not rapidly treated. So preeclampsia can be a life-threatening complication. Risk factors for preeclampsia. It is most common in women who have their first pregnancy very early in life or very late in life. It is more common on your first pregnancy than on subsequent pregnancies. It is more common in women who have a family history of it happening. But beyond that, we're not 100% sure why it happens. It is believed to be largely genetic in origin. How do we deal with it? Honestly, the only ultimate way of dealing with it is to deliver the infant, during which most of the symptoms will go away pretty quickly. But in the short term, we can give you blood pressure meds to try to reduce the heightened blood pressure that comes with it. Corticosteroids can help with some of the problems associated. If you're at risk of seizures, anticonvulsant medications can help. And in extreme cases where you're running the risk of serious seizures or hemolysis, complete bed rest is sometimes recommended, especially in the latter trimester of pregnancy for preeclampsia. All right. Now, I would be remiss if I did not finish this section without talking a little bit about some reproductive system cancers, of which there are several different ones that I would like you to know a few things about. Now, the obvious one that comes to mind that you think of right away when you think of reproductive system cancers is breast cancer. Breast cancer is the most common cancer in American women. 1 in 8 American women will get breast cancer at some point during their lifetime. We don't actually know how many annual cases there are because frankly, a lot of women do not get the mammograms that detect them, but about 40,000 women annually die of breast cancer. It's the most common cause of cancer death in women as well. Highest risk of breast cancer is in women who have the first child late in life for reasons we're not clear on, or in women who never have children. It seems they are more prone to it than women who have. In women with a family history, it very definitively runs in families. About 75% of cases happen after the age of 50, which is why starting at about your early to mid 40s, getting regular mammograms, M-A-M-M-O-G-R-A-M, to look for growths in the breast is a good idea. Breast self-examination, plenty of guides can be found to that online on how to do that. To feel for lumps in the breast is also a very important preventative. It's also strongly correlated with high fat intake, particularly diets high in saturated fats, and with hormone replacement therapy. So women on HRT are more likely to develop breast cancer. Now, in terms of treating it, if you do have it, the first thing we usually try is a lumpectomy, L-U-M-P-E-C-T-O-M-Y, removing the cancerous mass itself from the breast. Sometimes we will do a mastectomy, M-A-S-T-E-C-T-O-M-Y, or removal of the entire breast. In women who have a family history of breast cancer and a lot of risk factors, sometimes a double mastectomy, a preventative mastectomy, is done, removing both breasts in order to basically cut off the danger before it happens. Early detection is crucial. The high death rate in breast cancer is largely because of women who do not notice the problem until it's too late, because it does not typically present with a lot of symptoms until it is advanced, unless you're doing that regular exam and you can feel that thickened mass in the breast and get it taken care of before it becomes a serious problem. Now, another common cancer in women, but a little bit more readily treatable if caught early, is cervical cancer, cancer of the cervix. Cervical cancer is very dangerous if not caught early. If caught early, it can be adequately treated very easily. If not caught, it causes about 4,800, 5,000 deaths per year in the US. It's usually detected fairly easily during a standard gynecological examination. You have a pap smear, P-A-P. Pap smear is a fairly accurate test, more than 90% accuracy in detecting the occurrence of cervical cancer early on. So if you're getting regular gynecological exams and pap smears, you're probably not going to have to worry significantly about cervical cancer, at least, or if you find it, it'll be caught. Now, another important thing about it is that more than 70% of cervical cancers have been tied to a viral origin. This is one of the very few cancers that is almost always viral in origin. Specifically, two particular strains of HPV, human papillomavirus. I didn't say the number of cases, right? 14,000 cases annually, about 4,300 deaths annually, 4,300 to 4,800. It's going down these days, thanks to more and better pap smears that women are getting. So you get your regular gynecological exam, you'll probably catch it early if it is there to be caught. But yeah, two particular strains of HPV, human papillomavirus, P-A-P-I-L-L-O-M-A-V-I-R-U-S. That's all one word. Human papillomavirus. Well, the human's not part of it. Or HPV, better known as genital warts. That is the most common cause. Again, more than 70% of cervical cancer cases are linked directly to a case of HPV. And the awesome thing about this is absolutely preventable. A number of years ago, a vaccine called Gardasil, G-A-R-D-A-S-I-L, my bad, was produced, which vaccinates against several strains of HPV, including the two that are most likely to cause cervical cancers. So that's basically a cancer vaccine. Get that vaccine. Seriously, it's a really good vaccine to get because you're potentially blocking yourself from a really deadly cancer. Because if you're not getting regular pelvic exams and you don't catch cervical cancer early on, it doesn't present with a lot of external symptoms until it becomes quite advanced. So get the Gardasil vaccine. It could really save your life. Give it to your kids. It can save their lives, including guys. Don't just give it to women, because a lot of men are silent carriers of cervical cancer, because genital warts in men often do not present with any external apparent symptom. Ergo, a lot of men give it to their partners without knowing that they themselves have it. Also, we have recently learned that there is a strong link between the HPV virus and penile cancer, P-E-N-I-L-E, cancer of the penis. Now, when penile cancer happens, it usually presents with an obvious visible thickening or mass on the surface of the penis, so it's usually easily detectable. Again, the cervical masses are easily detectable with a pelvic exam, but not so much externally. So penile cancer is very easy to detect, and therefore tends to be a lot easier to treat. It happens less often in men than in women for reasons we are not clear on. The HPV virus affects women more strongly. And as a result, penile cancer, we only get something like 2,300 cases a year in the United States, only about 440, 450 deaths a year from penile cancer, because usually it's readily detectable early on, and normally it is an easy treatment with surgical excision of the cancerous mass. In some extreme cases, this will involve removal of the penis, but that has to be pretty advanced before that becomes a requirement. And that's obviously a treatment to be avoided because, if at all possible. While we're talking uniquely male cancers, talk about prostate cancer for a minute. Prostate cancer is the second most common cancer in men after lung cancer. About 1 in 9 men will experience prostate cancer during their lifetimes. It is more common, for reasons we are not clear on, in African American men. 1 in 6 African American men will develop prostate cancer. Both breast cancer and prostate cancer tend to happen later in life. They tend to happen to men in their 50s and older, like age 55 plus for both prostate cancer and breast cancer. We're not really clear on why. We know that there are about 191,000 cases of prostate cancer every year, about 33,000 deaths annually from prostate cancer. It is usually readily detectable with careful preventative measures. Digital rectal exam, or DRE, not comfortable, but it's an important way of checking for abnormal growth in the prostates. Also, elevated PSA levels, prostate-specific antigen, remember that. If you have heightened levels of PSA, that is often an early warning sign of prostate cancer. So a blood test for heightened PSA levels can help detect. It is definitely a cancer that tends to run in families, so if you've got a known family history, those examinations after your mid-40s or so become especially important. If detected early, prostate cancer is often really easy to treat. The 5-year survival rate of prostate cancer these days is in excess of 99%. A lot of times they can remove the cancerous mass if it's caught early. Sometimes this will require an entire prostatectomy, prostatectomy, removal of the entire prostates. That often does come with complications. Prostatectomy is often associated with erectile dysfunction and also urinary incontinence in the man following it happening, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanent. So we try to avoid a radical prostatectomy when possible. New surgical techniques that protect the nerves that pass through the prostate have been developed that make this less likely as of a consequence. But if it's possible to just remove the affected portion of the prostate and not the whole gland, that is preferable. All of these cancers I've talked about, I should point out, whenever we find the cancerous mass, cervical cancer usually does not require radiation treatment if you remove the cervical masses. Penile cancer, similar. But in a lot of cases, once the cancerous mass has been detected, radiation treatment of the affected area is a common practice to kill off any cancer cells that might have escaped. Prostate cancer is a weird one, because prostatic cells can easily be picked up by the lymphatic system and travel to other parts of the body, and therefore it often reoccurs years later after a man gets it. It is also a strange cancer in that prostate cancer tends to be one of the more slowly developing cancers. While there are men in which it happens quickly and aggressively, a lot of times prostate cancers grow very, very, very slowly. In fact, a lot of prostate cancers are so slow in their growth that doctors treat them as manageable conditions rather than conditions that need to be regulated with surgery or with chemotherapy or anything like that. Sometimes you can live with prostate cancer for 10 or 20 years before you have any severe symptoms that require more invasive treatment. And so for an older man in particular, a lot of times management of the condition is a preferable alternative, unless you're having deleterious side effects from a prostatic tumor, like blocking off of the urethra, interfering with either sexual intercourse or with urination or anything like that. And the most common cancer in young men is testicular cancer. Testicular cancer is most common in men between the ages of 15 and 35. We do not know why, but it seems to rarely happen after about age 35. About 9,600 cases of testicular cancer every year, about 440 of which result in death. Normally only affects one testis at a time. We're not clear on why. usually accompanied by a thickening or enlargement of the testis. Thick mass testicular self-exam can be used to detect a lump in the testis early on. Accumulation of fluid in the scrotal sac, pain and pressure, especially during urination or sex, difficulty urinating, difficulty ejaculating, can all be indicators. Because of the obvious and fairly visible symptoms on the external genitalia, testicular cancer is really easy to detect, which has a lot to do with its long-term survival rates. And the usual treatment is radical orchiectomy, ORCHIEOTOMY, or surgical removal of the testis. That's the easiest way to treat testicular cancer, because once you cut into a testis to remove the tumor, it usually isn't terribly functional afterwards anyway. So normally we just take out the offending testis, and that deals with the problem pretty well, which has a lot to do with the high survival rate for this particular cancer. Now, a much more insidious cancer in women is the analogous one, and that is ovarian cancer. Ovarian cancer has about 22,000 cases annually and about 14,000 deaths annually. It is a much more lethal cancer. And the reason for that, quite simply, is that ovarian cancer has very few obvious symptoms. There's no external symptom that will point to it being there. There are very few internal symptoms that indicate ovarian cancer. In fact, most of them don't present even with painful symptoms until it's relatively advanced. And the earliest symptoms that you get early on basically tend to be abdominal cramping and menstrual cramping that's more painful than usual. Ergo, the symptoms that ovarian cancer does present are easily mistaken for digestive troubles or for just a worse than usual period. So ovarian cancers are frequently not detected until they are quite advanced, and ergo their survival rate is relatively low as compared to many other cancers. Now, that said, pelvic exam can reveal warning signs of ovarian cancer early on, particularly if a woman has a known family history. Family history of ovarian cancer is a strong indicator of likelihood to get it later. For some reason we are not clear on, family history of breast cancer and colon cancer also seems to indicate for a likelihood of getting ovarian cancer as well. Should it be detected, we will almost always treat it with salpingo-oophorectomy of the affected ovary and the affected uterine tube. In some cases, doctors will argue for a bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy or complete hysterectomy at the same time to prevent the incidence of further reproductive tract cancers. Because a woman developing ovarian cancer, other ones also seem to be more likely for reasons that we are not yet clear on. So of all of ones I've listed here, although breast cancer is the one that has the highest annual death toll, ovarian cancer is in a lot of ways the hardest of these to prevent and detect simply because its symptoms are so stealthy. Okay, so that is a look at some of the important pathologies of the reproductive tract. One last thing I want to mention. I kind of glossed over that organ called the placenta before. The placenta forms during childbirth in the lining of the uterus. It connects the infant to the mom's body via the umbilical cord, U-M-B-I-L-I-C-A-L, the umbilical cord. Attaches at the location of the umbilicus, U-M-B-L-I, B-I-L, excuse me, I-C-U-S, which you know better as your navel or belly button. And that provides the blood supply to the developing infants, provides the oxygen supply to the developing infant, provides nutrition from mom's body, also provides immune defense. Now, normally, the placenta will be delivered at the same time as or momentarily after the delivery of the infants. That the placenta will come out along with the baby, or it will be passed out of the uterus immediately after. If it does not, we often call it the afterbirth for that reason. Now at that point, there's no longer a need for that connection to mom's blood supply. So at that point, what we do is we tie off the umbilical cord to prevent bleeding, and then we cut it off. What's left of the umbilical cord shrivels and breaks off, shortly thereafter. Your belly button is basically the scar that's left from what the remnants of the umbilical cord. There has been a cultural practice that some people have adopted in recent years in eating the placenta. Don't do that. There's no reason to do that. I don't know why somebody got the idea that this is a good thing. A lot of wild animals will eat the placenta because it provides them with a supply of meat right whenever they're tending to young and may not be able to hunt for food as effectively thereafter. But for us, there's no reason to do that. I don't know why people are eating their placentas. Don't do that thing. Okay, so I think this is a good point to tie off our lesson on the human reproductive system. Ran a little longer than my normal lesson, but I wanted to end this particular chapter. So I thank you all for your attention. I hope you're having a good afternoon. I don't know why I'm talking so weirdly today, folks. I'll talk to you all soon.